Baby, work it. Baby, work it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the Radical Books Collective, and I've been waiting for Meg Arenberg to join me. And I think I see her. Hey, Meg, you made it.
Hey, Bhakti.
Welcome to Friday the 13th, which is our witchy, momentous day for our event on desire and sex and queer love and, you know, some straight love. So, and we're excited to celebrate a bunch of books coming out all at the same time, and all of which I think we do believe have some subversive radical potential, especially when it comes to thinking about gender and desire. And I think, Meg, I wanted you to say something about being inspired by the Audre Lorde poem, because you got us on that track, and then we called it Beware My Smile.
Yeah, I'm having some connectivity issues, so if you can't really hear me, let me know.
No, I can hear you.
Okay, good. I mean, I would just say that as a poet in general who always wrote with unabashed honesty about the erotic and the sexual, Audre Lorde is a particularly appropriate muse for this event. But I think right around the time that you and I were first kind of conceptualizing it and planning and joking about harnessing the witchiness of Friday the 13th, I happened back across her poem, The Woman Speaks, which is where that line comes from. And to me, that poem really captures.
Oh, we've lost her. I guess she's having I guess it's witchy in other ways. All right, I'm going to start off. And since this is the Radical Books Collective, this is not just anything on desire. It's not the typical things we are used to. We are bringing you perspectives from around the world, Arab, African, Asian writers, editors, and translators. And we will feature this book, we will feature this book. And we had some issues, and Diriye Usman had to pull out, and he was to talk about the butterfly jungle, but we couldn't make it. So let me start with Selma Dabbagh and Marsha Lynx-Quayle. I'm going to beam them up. Hi, Selma. Hi, Marsha. Welcome to our event, and I'm so glad. I'm going to do a quick bio, and then I will exit and leave it to you. Okay, so we're featuring this book, edited by Selma, who is a British Palestinian writer of fiction. Her first novel, Out of It, was published in 2011 and was nominated for Guardian Book of the Year. It's been translated into Arabic, Italian, and French. Salma is also winner of the Premio Opera Prima Prize in 2019. She's published numerous short stories with Granta, Vasafiri, Saki, Telegram, and others, and has been a Pen and Pushcart nominee. But Selma has put on her editor hat for this superb collection. We Wrote in Symbols, Love and Lust by Arab Women Writers, and it was published by Saki Books, and she'll tell us about it in a minute. And then I'm excited to introduce Marsha Lynx-Quayle, who is founder and editor of the Arab Lit Collective. They have been producing translations and publishing translations of Arabic literature into English for over a decade, and in recent years have expanded into print with the gorgeous Arab Lit Quarterly. And Marsha is a talented translator herself, and recently translated Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands by Sonia Nimir. And we have a special appreciation for you, Marsha, because you are the advisory board member of the Radical Books Collective. So thank you both for being here, and I will remove myself. Go ahead.
Thanks, Bhakti. It's so great to be here, and thanks, Salma, for being here as well to talk about this collection. And the more I think about this collection, the more I think about how unusual it is in this space, in that it brings together women writing about love and lust from so many centuries, has such a wide remit and puts them together side by side. And so I wondered if you could talk about the origins of this anthology, the connections that you found between all these different centuries, and the choice not to run them chronologically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks, Marcia, for the question. It is a very broad and hugely ambitious project in terms of the thousands of years that it covers of Arab women's writing. And in terms of where the inspiration came from, I mean, one answer would be that the reading of the classical poetry and translation, which really hadn't been that widely available before, like the noughties, I would say. That's when I came across it with a Saki collection. And in that collection, just finding these very sort of sexually empowered, very kind of forthright voices among these other more traditional poems. So that was a kind of a wake-up point for me. But it was also just because it was, in a way, it was kind of fun. It was new for me. It was personal. It was daring. It was kind of these voices, these situations the women were getting into was kind of crazy and empowering. And there was such a range of writing in the contemporary writing that I found. And I also had seen that, like in more contemporary writing, in the last couple of years, there had been writers like Leila Slimani, who's featured in the book, who kind of broke boundaries, not just as an Arab woman writer of any kind, but as a contemporary writer in her explicit depiction of sex and the way that she did that. So I just thought it was curious to just put together these voices. In terms of ordering, we did try doing it chronologically, but it made it seem very staid and more of an academic tome. And these poems, the older ones, had existed in academic texts before. I wanted to make the essence of them, which is so raw and so fresh, to resonate in the modern day and to show how there's a reflection on more contemporary writers. Because between the sort of classical ones and the very contemporaneous ones, there's also this block-out period of complete silencing where there's hardly any writing by women. It lasts for about 500 years, from the fall of Andalusia to the late Ottoman period, early 20th century, where there's really nothing on romantic love or sexual love that has been, recovered or retrieved from that period. So putting them together brought that out. And the other thing that I chose not to do, which some people have been a little uncomfortable with, is to not have the dates on them, to make the reader work that little bit harder and to subvert preconceptions about what is that the modern age is the very liberated age and everything that came before was just working up in a sort of, a steady progression towards this freedom, because that's not what I was seeing at all.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I felt that for instance, in the letters from Zad Meher, the enslaved woman who's in Iraq, which I just loved. I found them sort of sexually like a little bit shocking, but also so relatable. I always think about how she called Baghdad a paradise for the prosperous and hell to the poor, and how deeply that resonates with so many cities now. And how those stories are so legible to us, and the poems, how they seem so relevant now. And I wanted to know what in particular you found in it that made you want to bring it together with contemporary writing. Why not just have contemporary, Arab women writers from the last century or something? Why did you want to bring this big tent together?
I guess in terms of why bring them together, I'll come on to Zadmir later because I love her and everything about that piece. Why bringing them together was partly, because I come from I've got this other career as a lawyer, and I've worked a lot on Palestine, and I've worked in activist circles. And I think it's this issue of writing as the Radical Books Collective celebrates, the idea of writing as subversion. Now, if you're going to carry out a subversive act, or if you're going to do something which is challenging the way that things are, two things. One is I think it is far better to see this as being part of your history rather than something which is imported or which is brought upon you. And this has been seen in other fields, like, for example, the debate around female genital mutilation and in Egypt. And Ahdaf Suaif has commented on this at the time, you know, that when it was like the big UN agencies coming in and saying this is what you must do, and there were, you know, it was kind of shaming the nation, then there was a retraction. Whereas if it was connected, you know, more with saying this is not part of our culture, this is a pharaonic thing, we don't have to connect this up with religion, you know, other ways of coming at it, that there was more ability for change. So that was one thing. The other thing is kind of an idea of strength in numbers. I mean, in terms of the number, the range, the different styles, the different voices. So that was why I wanted a lot of people who had sort of tried to resist in their own way, in their own style, some very, very subtly, some very provocatively and upfront. And that was part of the reason for selection. But I love the fact you picked out Zadmir's like commentary on society as a writer, because I think it's quite interesting, this thing of how women who write about sex in any way, all the focus gets to be on how they write about sex or them as a person and their sexuality. Whereas often you can get writers who write so powerfully about the intimate aspects of life, but they're also, through doing that, providing a very kind of bottom-up view of the society they live in. And a book I read recently, which I really admired in this way, was Claire Louise Bennett's Checkout 19, where she's talking about Anais Nin and how good, you know, the commentary on Paris in the 20s. But it was all sort of put down as just being erotica, and sort of relegated to the side. So the idea that you can be a writer of these things who also has this extraordinary fresh way of, I mean, bringing medieval back there to life.
Yeah, I think so many of them said so much about power relationships, and you know, what is a sexual relationship if not a relationship of power?
Yeah, and she refuses to be cowed. Yeah, absolutely. It's her master. She's totally dependent on him, but she's ridiculing him for his moustache and his stupid antics and his. But she, you know, I felt that she really loved him as well. So there's all this rage and then this total tenderness at the end. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. So if you could choose something from this extremely broad collection, just read us a bit of it.
I'll read a tiny bit of something. I'll start with something classical, very half of a poem, just because it ends on a nice point. So this is Khadija bint al-Ma'mun, so called Dabbagh, and she was the daughter of Caliph Ma'mun. So this is the Abbasid period, and she was taught music and poetry by her aunt Ulayya bint al-Mahdi, who features quite a lot. And the title for We Wrote in Symbols comes from one of her poems. But I like this. By God, tell that buck with the heavy buttocks and a waist so small, he is sweetest when he is ready, and when in ecstasy, he is the most gorgeous of all. And then I'll just go on to a contemporary piece, which is by Salome. Quite a few of the writers in the collection write under pseudonyms. And it's set in the West Country of England, so rural England. It's a party after a wedding, and there's been the couple getting married are Iranian English, and Zen, who's telling the story, is one of the guests, and she's with her new husband. So Zen returned to their tent before her husband on that first night. He'd blundered his way back later, stoned, telling her about the opium the uncles had smuggled through customs. Zen watched him zip a sleeping bag around his fully clothed body, complaining about the thinness of the ground mattress and the pains in his stomach. He'd removed an arm only to tap Zen's arse to tell her they were getting him on stage with a microphone the next night, if she would believe that, before he passed out. Zen had turned off her torch and lay still, her body trying to settle into the English country earth, listening out for the biblical lowing of cattle in the valley. A light had come on in the neighbouring tent, and she could make out the movement of the older brother and his gliding wife in their tent next door, streaks of limbs silhouetted against the thin fabric, entwined shadows reaching up to the stars. Zen heard their suppressed laughter, their orgasmic pulses rocking the earth. Even the movement of nylon sleeping bags under bare bodies could be made out, a grunt followed by a sharp, distinctive gasp, the groan of male satisfaction, the murmurs of praise followed by the cooing congratulations of love. Zen couldn't believe how it was that a woman could come so fast. Not for the first time, she wondered whether there was an anatomical glitch in her body's wiring. I think I'll stop there, just because it's a short reading.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really love about this collection, and that these two selections also highlight, is that it's not all, I mean, some, collections of erotica are necessarily all sort of trying to, all sex positive, sex is great, sex is all fantastic. But in this collection, there are many disappointing sexual experiences, many people who don't feel that they're getting the kind of sex that they would like, and sex in very difficult situations, sex in a refugee camp in the toilets. And I wondered why it was that you had decided to approach love and lust from such sort of a broad view of the heights, the slender waists and the wide buttocks, and the as well, the sort of the hot writing, as well as this kind of sexually frustrated writing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the it was quite hard to, in terms of what material we had, we probably which we selected from, we probably ended up with about 2/3. We had another 2/3 that we left out, and we were trying to not necessarily have works that were sex positive. What we wanted was a feeling of articulacy in navigating that situation, or perhaps trying to console oneself or to rework it in a subtle way. So they weren't all triumphant at all, but we didn't want it to be overly mournful. We didn't want it to be sort of victim based. And we just wanted to respond because we had 3 criteria. One was that the quality of writing was really high. 2, that it was on point, that it was about love and lust. And 3, that it had that sort of less mournful but more nuanced approach. I mean, not all of the pieces do. And then there were also, I really wanted a diversity of languages and a diversity of so we had English, French, and Arabic. Some works in translation for the first time, and and Derija, and we also had pretty much every Arab country was covered in some way. So we were trying not to get too Palestinian heavy, for example. So when you brought all those factors into account, you couldn't really get one voice about how one felt about sex, which dominated. It was very varied, and we embraced that variance, because you can get a group of 5 women who will just always vary dramatically, not just in terms of their attitude, but with each relationship that they have, that the range and the capacity to feel strongly about this one aspect of our lives is enormous, and it's global, and it's
So I only asked this because I did recently read a sex scene written by a man that was actually very good, which is unusual. And so it made me wonder what made you decide on focusing on women's writing.
Yeah, it's really difficult, because it's almost like with this anthology, we created a stereotype and then we try to explode it. So the title kind of bonds it to a stereotype. It's like Arab women and sex. You've immediately got this idea of an Orientalist, a monolithic view. I mean, like this idea that there's a fetishized vision. I don't believe that women write differently to men. I know that there are, I don't believe that women can't write men or men can't write women. I think that when people have been given, literary editors, etc., have been given texts and they've stripped the name from them, it's very difficult to tell who writes, who's written it, what gender they are, where they come from. And that's one of the glories of writing to me. One of the huge freedoms is the androgyny you can adopt within it. So it wasn't because I thought necessarily that it was going to be better writing because it was coming from women, but it was just that the fact that there's such a long culture of writing by women in the Arab world, I don't think is known. The fact that there are so many women who are writing quite bravely and are tolerated for doing so, I also don't think is known. There's also have been some who have been taken to court, who have been censored, who have suffered hardships because of their writing, which they wouldn't if they were men. And that I wanted to include them. So it was it's a bit of a ragtag bunch of writers, but them being women made a difference to their lives. Whether it made a difference to their writing, I don't know, but it made a difference to how they were seeing these things, or how we see them. So that,
Right. So you mentioned this sort of this sort of nature of Arab women's writing in as part of the title. And I had mentioned to you that, so I recently read this study of Arabic literature translated into French, and a scholar had looked at the jacket copy of all the books. And the thing that recurred the most was, and this is somewhat specific to French, although I think these kind of things that occur in English as well, was that it's a woman breaking a taboo for the first time, crossing the red line to write about sex. How many times could it be the first time? God only knows. But and I just wondered, how do you sort of navigate that sort of relationship of realizing there is a certain degree of this reception of, oh my God, Arab women write about sex versus that narrowing versus opening it up to connect with readers.
I think very difficult, and it has to be done very in a very personalized negotiation. I mean, I went to Saki just because I felt that they knew this area very well and that they weren't going to sensationalize, and they were aware of the sort of Orientalist debate. I think also, I mean, the idea of breaking taboos, it's how it's packaged. It's often how it's packaged is often, how it's conceived, how it's packaged. There are lots of different processes involved. I think to go back to the sort of, I've found this also, like writing on Palestine, is that you have the way that publicity works, for example, is they want to say there are certain formulas that that are decided at the publicity level, not at the editorial level or even it's just, this is what we can do. This is how we can get the bookseller's attention for like 2 seconds. So you need these things, and it can it can slightly reduce the nuance that the other levels are trying to get on board. So, but I think in terms of the genuine connections, the way that we try to, the people who have reviewed this, and the way that it has been picked up in terms of an ideal readership, I think we've managed to get it there, which was more through channels like, magazines in Egypt, or English language magazines in Asymptote Journal. They were sort of literary publications which were taking the gravity of the book seriously. And we were very happy it got picked up by the Washington Post as well. But not in a, sorry, I'm tying myself up in knots a little bit with this question, because it's a little bit this issue of like, there are always going to be desires to make a book sensational within the chain of its production. That's going to happen. And, you know, it's just, yeah. But
it does seem to be that people are stepping back a little bit from how does this appeal to, you know, to this particular one white reader in either in London or in Ohio, that recognizing that English has a sort of a global readership of places all around the world, and that shifts a little bit how.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I also had a lot of writers who are kind of like me. They're mixed between Europe and the Arab world, and it was, for me, my discovery of the Arab world was through English translation, like later in life. And it was a very important thing for me. And I think some of the work, like with the Zadmir translations, were van Gelder, and some of the, you know, translation workshops that I went to were really revolutionary in my understanding of that kind of heritage. So I was sort of kind of thinking of my, you know, women like me, or, you know, and it's been picked up by a lot of women in, for example, in the Gulf, whose, you know, the way that they live their lives and the way that they are supposed to live their life, there's a huge disparity between the accepted norm and what they're supposed to be able to talk about and what's actually going on that matters to them. So that kind of readership, some of whom don't ever read in Arabic. They might read English novels. Arabic might be their first language, but they don't read in Arabic. So.
So you mentioned so there are pieces here from the Gulf, and you mentioned this, so this blackout period where either there wasn't women writing by women, or we simply don't, it wasn't preserved. Were there other places and times that you were trying to gather writing from that you found difficult, and or places where there was so much great writing about sex being produced in this?
Yeah. So I mean, within this 500-year moratorium, mainly covered by the Ottoman period, I did put out some feelers, and I can't say definitively. And when Chin Ouyang was like saying, you can't, you know, there hasn't been enough research on like the Mamluk period, for example. But some of the people I talked to, they said, well, really, you might get love poems, but it's very religious. It's sort of like it comes. And you find this also in European writing by women, you know, some of these sort of writings by saints. I mean, you could really say that there's a lot of very sexual imagery in their sort of religious, you know, texts. So there could be more there. In terms of, I did have a risk at one point of getting a little bit too kind of focused on this sort of Sham region, you know, like Lebanon. It seemed to be Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Morocco. These were sort of the areas where there was more writing on this subject. Yeah.
And not as much, I mean, for me managing the magazine, Egypt is always like sort of, there's always too much from Egypt. So not as much from Egypt.
Not as much from Egypt, but I cannot say that my, I mean, I have Ahtaf Swaif's piece, which was like probably the first piece I identified that I wanted to have in, was one of the, you know, key cornerstones for the book. And then I have the poem by Heba. Yeah, not so much. I mean, I could have probably, you know, there could be another volume which has more Egyptian writing, I'm sure. Yeah.
Right. So sort of last question, because I know we're running short on time, but so I wanted to ask about sort of what's been generated. It's been out for a couple of years now?
A year and a bit.
A year and a bit. So what sort of the generative nature of it, like what you know about in terms of people who've read it and what it, you know,
Yeah.
an effect of it?
Well, I think it's really hard to know, but I think we've had some really positive feedback, mainly on an individual level from readers, and there's been a lot of excitement on that level, and people saying, I want to write my own book now. I want to, I really, this is my, this is my experience and that kind of thing. But I don't know that any novels have come out of it yet. There's also been, there was an idea that I had with Marina Warner, which is still sort of bubbling along, to merge it with some sort of theatrical production with installations, and she did some ballet work with the New York Ballet on some of there's the work by Ibn Sa'i, The Consorts of the Caliph, which talked about the women of the court, to see whether we could do that. When we had an event around the book in London, we had the most amazing performances by 3 of the British Arab writers contained in the collection: Sabrina Mahfouz, Lisa Lux, and Laura Hannah, who are all performers. They've all worked as actors or they perform their own work. And it was just explosive. It was fantastic. It was, and I feel it's a shame that it was presented for such a small audience. But we have been in lockdown, semi-lockdown for most of the period of it coming out. But for me to go back to lockdown, for me, it was a network of these writers and translators that formed around the creation of the book that I just found personally so extraordinarily liberating and freeing for me in every aspect of my life, just to sort of learn from them and to know they're out there and to read more of their works. Yeah, and I hope that people will just go on and read more of these writers as well as writing their own work.
So do you have events coming up?
We're going to the Bradford Literary Festival. I think that's the next thing on my list. But other than that, not so much. No, not so much. Not in the immediate future. No, but yeah, hopefully soon.
All right.
It's been a slow festival season.
Yeah, I guess COVID has made everything these last 3 years a bit slow.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Bhakti is supposed to leap back on. Ah, there she is.
Here I am. Thank you so much, Selma. Thank you so much, Marcia. I'm going to now welcome Kiru Taye, and I'm going to say goodbye to Marcia and Selma.
Hi, Kiru.
Hello.
Hi, Kiru. Nice to meet you. How are you?
Hi, Bhakti. I'm okay. How are you?
Good. I'm all right. Very excited about this.
Great.
Welcome. And I am going to...
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is our Radical Books Collective event. It's called Beware My Smile on Radical Desire. And we have a mix of people here, people talking about erotica, people talking about queer poetry, people having more political stuff like the sex lives of African women. And you're the only romance novelist on here. And for those who don't know, I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'm going to read out your bio, which is so impressive. Kiru Taye is joining us from London, though you're originally from Nigeria, I believe. Kiru has a whooping 32 novels under her belt, which is shocking and incredibly impressive, since you don't look like you're 80 years old.
No.
Her debut novella, His Treasure, won the Love Romance Cafe Book of the Year in 2011.
That's correct.
The stories in the popular Essien series are international bestsellers. In fact, she's a USA Today best-selling author. Kiru is the founder of the publishing firm Love Africa Press, as well as the co-founder of Romance Writers of West Africa, a support organization for African romance writers. So that is amazing, and welcome. And I'm going to just ask you a very easy question, probably one you've thought of or have been asked. How did you get started with this? Maybe a little glimpse into your childhood or your youth that drew you to this genre.
Okay. Yeah, so romance writing. Actually, I started as a reader. I used to read a lot of romance novels when I was a teenager. I mean, those were the things when I was growing up in Nigeria that were kind of easy to get hold of. You know,
Yeah.
Harlequin, Mills and Boons, you know, those type of novels. We had the also the Pace Setters series in
Mhm.
Nigeria, which were kind of major. So they were kind of romance, thrillers, those kind of things. So yeah, as a teenager, I read practically everything. You know, I just loved
Yeah.
reading, and romance novels were kind of prevalent. But when I got into my 20s and my 30s, I didn't really. I kind of went off. I read other things, but not necessarily romance. I think I kind of picked up a romance novel probably about 2009, 2008, 2009 was my kind of when I went back to romance novels.
Mhm.
And I just remember looking at, you know, picking one up and just thinking, oh, I used to read these as a child. And I thought, but how come I never see Africa? There were
Mhm.
always kind of Caucasians, there were kind of Europeans, there were Americans, but there weren't necessarily African people in these stories. And I kind of thought, well, um,
Right.
so I kind of did a little bit of a research, um,
Mhm.
and I thought, well, if there are no stories, why not? You know, why
Mhm.
not write them? You know, and that's kind of really, at the time I was working in the corporate. I was kind of, you know, working in a corporate office, and
Oh,
I wanted to change jobs. I had kids, I had little kids, and I needed something option where I could work from home, I could manage my time a little bit better,
mhm.
and it just kind of the two things kind of just happened, you know, at the same time. This is around 2010. Um, so
Okay.
I started kind of writing. The first thing I wrote, I submitted to Harlequin,
Oh.
Mills and Boons. This was back in 2010. They were running a competition for new voices. It was called
Mhm.
New Voices in 2010. And I submitted it, kind of long list, you know, and I was like,
Mhm.
wow, okay, okay, so maybe I have something here. And that's basically how my writing career kind of started up. Really, it was just, yeah. From then on, I just went and wrote other things. I submitted to places,
Mhm.
and publisher in Canada picked up my first story. The one, the first is Treasure, is Treasure,
Okay.
and it got published in 2011.
So the Harlequin thing did not work out.
So no, so yes, I got to the top 10 in script,
Mhm.
but they requested the first three chapters. That's it. And but then they didn't take it on. So, you know, so that kind of, yeah. So that didn't go anywhere. As I said, this was back in 2010.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of went on and wrote other stories. So that was a different story. So I went on and wrote other things. So actually the story that I submitted to Harlequin, I never did anything with it. I just
Mm.
kind of packed that one and just kind of forgot it. So I wrote other things, and the one that got accepted, the first one that got accepted, that's the one that got published in 2011.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. You know, I noticed that, and this is because we both know Ainehi Edoro, who runs the fabulous Brittle paper. So I teach African literature, contemporary African literature a lot, and I noticed, you know, I've taught Americana by Chimamanda Adichie several times. Students always love this book, and of course, you know, it's about a lot of things, but really it's like a wonderful love story. And I know that you ended up writing a fan fiction
I did. Yeah.
about it, and I believe it was called, here it is, Lunch with FMLO.
Yes.
And so, you know, I just wondered, for my own curiosity, why this book, and why did you choose to intervene in the way that you did? I know that it's a sexier meeting between Obinze and FMLU. It's very explicit. What was going on here? What were you thinking?
Yeah, the answer is quite simple with that one. Actually, I know he. So we were doing a project. I was doing a project with Ainahi. So she kind of suggested this fan fiction series. I did one on Things Fall Apart,
Hmm.
and then she picked
Wow.
the Chimamanda one,
Hmm.
and then I actually did one on Lagoon by Nadia Carafa as well. So I've done quite a few, which is basically I was just kind of playing around. And I was thinking, so what if this? What if this character is this? That? So that was really just the concept, really. And I
Yeah.
just played around and just got a little bit more, just steamed it up a little bit. That's just we just added the Kiru Taye take on it, really.
Right. And maybe I'm just kind of programmed to be critical, but it almost makes you see like that the sex is missing, right? Is that the
Exactly.
intervention? You always, that's what's missing, and then you're giving it that sort of explicit type of touch. So yeah, I think that's cool. You have 32 books, and I had put up a little we made a little collage, and look at them all. I mean, these fabulous covers, so many characters, trilogies, series. You have a lot going on, and I just wondered, what is the inspiration for these many plots and characters that you've now set in motion? Do you draw from your life and friends, or is it movies,
Life. I mean,
Nollywood, literature?
I kind of take inspiration from kind of things that happen around me. I kind of listen to people. Um, I watch the news. I kind of listen to people and interaction with friends, family. Everything kind of feeds into it. I mean, when I started writing, I remember when my first book came out, and I got asked the question. Are Africans? They was asking about, are Africans romantic? Are Africans kind of sexual? African. And I was like, hang on a minute, why are we not? So kind of I had to kind of push back on that, because I remember actually with His Treasure, because His Treasure is a historical romance, and someone asked, well, did our ancestors actually do it this way? And I was like, well, if our ancestors didn't do it, you wouldn't be here. Do you really think that sex was invented today? It wasn't. Obviously, we've kind of got their kind of cycles, and the kind of things, but nothing that it's happening now is kind of new.
Hmm. Of course. No, of course. I do wonder though.
There's quite a lot of that happened before, and kind of sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think we had a momentary lag. I said,
Did you say something?
yes. I think we had a small lag, but I'm going to ask you a question, which is, can you hear me? Oh, Kiru, have we lost you? Are you back? I think we had an internet issue or something.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, I was saying that of course you're right. We wouldn't be here if our ancestors and everyone after wasn't being naughty. But I was wondering, I was wondering if if you're aware of like more specifically Nigerian approaches, writing or in culture. Are there ways in which romance, desire, erotica is actually expressed? Is there something unique that we don't know? I know that your books remind me more of the Mills and Boon Harlequin series, but is there something more longer kind of history within Nigerian culture, West African culture? I don't know.
Well, what I would say is, because I was talking about, His Treasure, and when I was kind of writing that story, I had a lot of it was kind of anecdotes from from my grandmother. So like when I was growing up, my grandma used to tell us stories about, kind of rites of passage, and the way kind of like women, kind of rituals that were kind of performed for when girls were becoming women, kind of thing, and before marriage and things like that. So a lot of those things are kind of reflected in those stories, even though I don't necessarily explicitly kind of state them always, but that's kind of part of what's informed. Because I know, because she's mentioned something like a lot of their practices and kind of information that were given to young girls and women who were going into their marriagehood were kind of lost when Christianity came on board, because they were kind of seen as, kind of fetish and pagan and not necessarily, so kind of religion, especially Christianity, kind of wiped out a whole lot of those kind of rituals. And
Mhm.
should I say word of mouth, kind of the way things are handed down, kind of rites of passage kind of rituals. So unfortunately, a lot of it is lost. I mean, there are kind of still places where some of those things are practiced, but what I got from her, I kind of fed into those stories. So there's a little bit of that in there. Obviously, the more contemporary ones are kind of,
Mhm.
lived experiences sometimes and just kind of fantasy in other places. Yeah, but the historical ones are definitely reflect kind of anecdotes from my grandmother. So
Yeah, that's fabulous. I wanted to, I mean, we are the Radical Books Collective, so we're going to ask you some political stuff. So I wanted to ask you broadly. I know what you're doing that's subversive. You're taking the genre of romance, and then you're making it a culturally Nigerian, and you're making it Black. You're making it about Black love, Black desire. But is there more? Is there a different gender politics? Is there a different politics to the type of bodies that you are describing? Is there a different type of power dynamic between the protagonists? Is there other interventions that you're doing?
well, I mean, I come from I kind of write from exploring female kind of female orgasms, to be honest. If I was going to put it explicitly, that's basically the basic. That's my agenda. It's about celebrating
Uh-huh.
the woman's body. Is about kind of women taking ownership of their body in sexual situations and kind of really stating their desires and kind of really being quite explicit about it with their partners. So if you kind of read my books, you find that even though I mean I kind of write different kind of characters, but in most cases, I empower them and kind of show women who kind of take pleasure in sex. It's not just like they're not just lying there and kind of
Yeah.
thinking of England or thinking of Nigeria.
Good. Oh gosh.
So yeah, so
Okay.
that's my thing. It's about so I kind of feel that if you don't say what you want, if you're not explicit, then don't complain if you're not getting it. Do you understand? So, and that's kind of where I come from in terms of
Okay.
my and I kind of I put that in the stories. I remember when as I said those earlier when I started writing, I remember getting emails and messages from other women and saying, wow, it's kind of opened your stories have opened my eyes and made me a little bit more kind of um bolder,
Yeah.
kind of how I approach sex with, and these were married women, and some of them were saying, "Oh, I never had an orgasm," and I was like, "Thank God you've never had an orgasm." So I was like, "Well, if you don't know your body, how is your husband supposed to know it?" The other time you've got to kind of take on understand where are your erogenous zones, what are the things that make you feel sexy, so those are things that I kind of because as I said that when I started, I grew up in my generation. Probably we were not necessarily taught sex. Do you understand? I mean, the conversation I had with my mother as a teenager,
Mhm.
sex was basically, oh, if you hang out with boys, you're gonna get pregnant. So that was
Not untrue, but yes.
that was it. That was it. So we so there's a whole generation of us. Obviously, it's kind of slightly different now, but
Mhm.
kind of for
Yeah.
the sake that I'm like, so my generation, so for me, I wanted to kind of, sex was not talked about. And I kind of wanted to kind of put it out there and say, you know what, I'm not going to hide it. Everybody's doing it. Nigerian population, we're like, what, 200 million or something? So
Yeah.
people are doing it, but you don't want to talk about it. Why not? So yeah, that's my politics.
Yeah, of course, and it's really appreciated, and you're selling them, and you're doing so well. Let me fight with you just a little bit on the topic of pleasure, right? So often in the romance novel, and I read the Essence saga in your case, which I enjoyed, absolutely delicious. The protagonist is so wealthy, right? Why is it so important? So in romance novels, for the guy to be super rich, what is the pleasure in this wealth? I'm just, you know what I'm saying? Like, why? And he's not just wealthy, they're like so wealthy, they're dynastic, you know?
Yeah. Good question. Actually, you know, I hadn't really thought about it, but actually, I think a lot of it is about, you know, just knowing that, you know, I don't know if you remember these songs, a song in from the 90s, TLC, No Scrubs.
Yeah.
Remember that? So it's
Mhm.
this kind of thing about, you know, I mean, the whole kind of, I think part of the thing about the kind of the rich, you know, the billionaire kind of protagonist or kind of male lead, or even sometimes I've written, you know, female kind of billionaires as well. It's like it's about, it's that kind of fantasy element, it's that kind of aspirational element that, you know, life as it is a struggle, you know. We all kind of, and you, when you're kind of in this kind of context, you want to kind of escape your struggles. You don't want to have to worry about, you want to kind of feel like, oh, you know, there's this person you're going to meet and you don't have to worry about your bills, and you don't have to worry. And to be honest, that's the appeal of it. It's just that
The escape.
you just, you know, just escaping real life, because you know you've got to pay bills, you know you've got to have to work extra shifts, you know, just to kind of, you know, if you want to go on holiday or whatever. So all these things, that all the struggles you have in real life, when you pick up that book, you want to feel that, put yourself in a female lead position and kind of feel, oh, I'm going to meet this man who's going to sweep me off my feet, and that I never have to worry about paying the bill. I mean, it's fantasy, you know. Obviously there's an element of it that is fantasy and it's aspirational, but for a lot of readers, it's you know, it's a thing. It's part of the appeal. Do you understand? Because they
Yes,
know
absolutely.
it's an escape.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, years ago, I co-worked on on a like a little like magazine piece or something about what was becoming popular, and which was an alternative to the romance novel. It was called chick lit, you know, and it
Okay.
started with like Sex and the City and Bridget Jones and Jennifer Weiner, I think, was another one. And then they were a bit different because they were girls who was struggling, like they were either financially struggling or they were struggling because they were a bit older, they were in the 30s, and that was considered like they were having pressure to find love and so on. So but the romance novel remains pure pleasure. So there was a kind of realism in those works, that you never found in the romance novel. You know, in the end, that she gets the guy. It's just about the journey to how exactly, when exactly.
Actually, I mean, talking about romance novels anyway, I mean, there are quite a variety. If you want the billionaires, they're there, but if you want like the blue collar kind of, you know, heroes, those ones are there as well. So that, you know, you get firefighter, you get the mechanic. I've got a story coming out, and the guy is a mechanic. He's like, you know, he hasn't got a billion stashed somewhere anywhere. You know, so there variety of stories. You know, I mean, obviously, as I said, the big sellers are those kind of billionaire ones. Those are kind of, you know, quite popular. But you know, as I said, there is, you know, you get the full range.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you make of the craze with Bridgerton? And they have taken an extremely white writer, and then they have each season introduced sprinkling of color, right? Why didn't they just buy your works? Like, what do you make of the way in which this happens? You know?
Okay, so I'll start with the positive. It's positive that actually that a romance book or romance books have been kind of translated to, you know, a TV series and TV shows. So that's definitely positive.
Yeah.
But I kind of, I'm uncomfortable with, you know, books that were originally written as, you know, kind of cishet kind of white characters, because, you know, as I said, as you already said, the author is white. The original books
are very white, actually.
White, you know, characters. And obviously but now, I mean, the first series, we know, you know, there was the black, and then obviously this series, they're kind of the Asian characters. So, you know, for me, I am uncomfortable. That's the word I'll use. I don't necessarily want to knock it, because in a sense, you know, obviously that's good. But I kind of feel like if you want to make shows about people of color. There are authors. There are plenty of authors.
Yeah.
An example is Beverly Jenkins. I mean, I would love to see her books on the screen. I would love to see her books on. So, that's right there. You have historical,
Yeah.
characters of
Yeah.
color, So,
Yeah.
and there are plenty of other writers, I'm sure across Asia as well that, you can
So many.
books that can be, translated to the screen. So, yeah, I just think it's a shame that books went that,
Mm-hmm.
we can't. It's a kind of click and bait. It's bait and click.
Look, to me,
Where you kind of make these, they see these characters on their screens and they go and buy the books, but then it's totally different in the books. So, and I just think it's a shame, but
yeah,
it's what
yeah.
it is.
I mean, as someone who studied like post-colonial literature or colonialism, once upon a time, the books that were very popular is the sort of frigid English girl who goes into the jungles of, India or Nigeria or whatever, and slowly, like, her, top
Oh,
starts
yeah.
to get looser,
Oh,
and she
yeah.
finds her passion, and she finds this kind of jungle fever element. She fantasizes. So to me, Bridgerton is actually a continuation of the
Yes.
colonial
Yeah.
fantasy, where it's like, it's not sexy unless the guy is Zimbabwean or the girls are Indian, or you know what I mean? Like, they have put the spice through it. And I understand that Shonda Rhimes, who's the creator, is a Black woman, but to interpose those characters of color on the Regency era women, and we can't fight it too much. We know it's fantasy, it's speculative fiction, and people love it. I get it.
Well,
But
that's the thing, yeah. As I said, they're kind of positives to it. Obviously, it is doing quite well, and that's brilliant, But I also want to see
it's annoying.
books written by people of color being translated. For me, that's important as well, So
Absolutely. Let me ask you a writing question. Where is the line between erotica and romance? Like, how do you draw that line? I know that you are in both, but when you're writing, you know what I'm saying?
yeah. So for me, yeah, I kind of try and balance the two. The important thing, erotica stories. So okay, let me start with romance stories. Basically, there are kind of key elements to it. So there's got to be the central love story. With these two characters, multiple characters. I've written multiple partners, so it could be any kind of different combinations, but ultimately there's got to be love story in there, and there's got to be the happy ending. So the characters that you're pairing up with, or all have to end up together at the end of the story. That's the thing about a romance novel. That's basically, it's about that journey to the end. So the end is guaranteed. There's got to be the happy ending, But in erotica, there doesn't have to be a happy ending. So you can bring two people. They could basically be, two ships passing in the night, basically, and they do the deed and they go their own way. There is no guarantee that they're going to end up together. So that's the thing about erotica. But it's about the sexual tension. It's about the pleasure. Is about that. It's about basically that kind of erotic experience, that erotic adventure, maybe. That's really what it's about. There's no, they could do it and then just kind of say, oh, bye, see you in another life, and that's it. And that's okay, because that's erotica. But in romance novels, you've got to guarantee the reader wants to see that ending where they're all together and they're kind of living life beyond the sexual experience, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the difference between the two. And so for me, I try and find because I want the steam, but I also want the romance.
It's plot driven, and there is some aspiration or some journey that the reader goes on. That's a bit different. So it seems like you do some advocacy work, by which I mean that this is a genre or this is a style of writing that people don't necessarily think, okay, I'm dying to write this and I'm going to go ahead and publish it. it appears to me just from your bio, with you started Love Africa Press, you are co-founder of the Romance Writers of West Africa. These are supportive advocacy moves. What's the struggle for a future romance writer?
What's the struggle? Well, first of all, I mean, a lot of part of the reason Love Africa Press exists is because African publishers don't want to publish romance novels. They'd rather have, they'd rather publish, trauma. I mean, and those things are valid. I'm not necessarily saying those things are wrong, but it's almost as if African joy should be it's kind of at the bottom of the pile, if you understand what I mean. So like
Wow, okay.
the big publishers don't necessarily want those stories. They're like, if there's no pain involved, if there's no trauma involved, if there's no, that kind of seriousness, kind of harsh reality involved, they don't want to see it. So unfortunately, you have these writers who are kind of floating and who don't have a home, which is basically a lot of people are contacting me and saying, "Oh, Kiru, we see what you're doing. Well, how can you help us?" And I just kind of thought, okay, fine, I've got to kind of bite the bullet and do, so it's really about kind of supporting all the writers who want to, write something different, kind of, within the either erotica or romance, and that's why I exist. Also, when I started writing as well, it was important for me to network with other writers, and we're writing similar things. I mean, writing in general is great, but also just supporting each other and kind of helping each other grow, which is why Romance Writers of West Africa exist. I mean, we are then to Romance Writers of South Africa, this group as well, which is also doing quite well. So, we were just, it was a thing that started, I think, back in 2012. Yeah. And it's, I'm kind of, for me, it's important to see other writers do well, because you can't exist in a vacuum,
Sure. Yeah, writing is isolating enough. I'm so shocked to hear you say this, because nobody complains louder than the literary serious people about getting published. I mean, you have to know, like, they are the ones who are just the absolute victims of all kinds of publishing politics, right? Whereas to me, these are the kind of books that can make money. I know I have so many friends, who buy them by the dozen,
Absolutely.
So I don't know how publishers, and then you have how publishers haven't gotten wind of the economic profit level in this. And the other thing is things like 50 Shades of Grey, which is a movie, which is a this, which is a that. And all she did was do an ebook. Like, this was the first ebook that sold, So I'm very surprised. So I'm going to ask you a last question, because we're going to be out of time soon. If you think of if there's a young person wanting to start off and write this, what advice would you give? They're just
first things first. I would suggest reading widely, and I'm not just saying in the romance genre. I'm just saying reading widely. Just so you can see what's out there, understand what. I mean, it's important to kind of research, understand the genre as well, because a lot of people claim they write romance, but they don't actually write romance. They write literary fiction, but because the characters are in love. I mean, like, an example is that the people think Romeo and Juliet is a romance. It's not. It's a tragedy. Romance novels are not tragedies. So that's an example. So people kind of, if you're going to kill off your characters at the end of the story, it's not a romance novel. And be aware that if you write it, if you label it as romance and sell it, you're going to get tanked. Your reviews are going to be horrible. Just so do research.
Okay, so don't kill people. One. No murders or death. But I'm very disappointed in your advice, Kiru, because I thought everybody says read widely if you want to be a good writer. I was hoping you'd say, like, sleep around widely. Go do crazy things. Try this, try that. Are you not gonna give this advice?
Oh my goodness.
Really? Marriage, leave those children at home.
That's not the advice I'm gonna give. That has really nothing to do with it. But I mean, it's all up here, where I think
It's you
also, what
alone
I
with
was
your
actually
laptop
gonna say,
at the end of
the
the
other thing I
day.
was going to say is let your imagination run free. Just because that's another thing. People kind of they kind of restrict. I mean, obviously, because when I started writing, it's like, oh, should I put in sex scenes? And obviously, when you get pushback, and if you kind of come from an African background, you're probably gonna get pushback. You probably don't want your mother reading your book. You probably don't want
Ooh.
some people, but I don't. For me, it's like, so you have to understand yourself, and obviously write within your own your comfort zone, but really try not to stifle your creativity. So just let it. If you want to write what you want to write. Write what makes you comfortable.
Okay.
Those things are important.
That's very genuine and very serious, and you're quite right. Thank you very much, Kiru. This was so fun, and hopefully we'll do more things together. And I'll read more of your books because I haven't read all of
Thank
them
you
yet.
so much. Thank you,
You're
Bhakti.
welcome. Thanks very much.
Right.
Hi, Meg. I'm adding you.
I'm so sorry about my earlier troubles. I seem to be stable now. So I'll
Good.
stay with you. I don't know how much you heard of my, I feel I was in the middle of my
Educatively explaining.
on Audre Lorde, just as we got cut off. But anyway, talking about her, erotic power.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we harness more of that now with Kiru, and I think a little more political with the next one. Do you want to say a bit more?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, from this, launching point of steamy fantasy narrative, we're going to kind of shift to the nonfiction side with Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah's collection, The Sex Lives of African Women, which was just published last summer by Dialogue Books and Astra House.
Hello.
This stems, from intimate interviews with over 30 Black and Afro-descendant women about their actual lived experiences of sex and desire. So we're going to move to this fabulous recorded conversation between Rudo Mudiwa and author Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah.
Okay. Let's hope I haven't messed it up here.
Thank you all for joining me for the Radical Books Collective event titled Beware My Smile on Radical Desire. My name is Rudo, and I am an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Irvine. And my wonderful guest today is Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah, who is the co-founder of the blog Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women. She's also the author of The Sex Lives of African Women, which I'm excited to discuss today. Nana is an organizer and a writer who makes the tantalizing promise of Black women's congregation real through her work. To my mind, her work points to the liberatory potential of African feminist thinking and writing. And when I was thinking about this introduction, I initially wanted to say that this book is not just about sex, because I wanted to point to the fact that it's really about the question, the challenge of freedom for Black women, for African women, the struggle to find and live an independent life, the struggle to know oneself. But then I thought, to say it's not about sex actually blunts the provocation of the book. It is about sex and about African women desiring it, healing from it and through it, and claiming it on their own terms. So Nana, welcome. It's really a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm so excited to learn from you and to discuss this book with you today.
Thank you so much, Rudo. It's really great to be here. And I was just smiling through your introduction. So thank you for that very generous introduction.
So let's start by talking about, you are the co-founder of this blog, The Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, which, if people have not made that a part of their internet diet, they should. I myself was a regular reader. I think I started reading it in 2014, and I actually heard about it from other Zimbabwean feminists. Then I became a really avid reader. And it was just it's a delicious treat. I would read the entries, and I think I was working on my dissertation, and it was just man, it was feeding me while I was working on my dissertation, to read these just juicy stories. So what made you want to move from, cultivating this really beautiful online space to wanting to put together this anthology, to move from one form to the other.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. In a sense, I haven't moved from one form to the other because the blog still exists. It's still extremely vibrant. It's just that I also wanted to create a book. And really, part of what I've been doing for years with Malaika and all the other people who've been contributing to the blog is encouraging African women to share the experiences of sex, sexualities, and pleasure. And, obviously on a blog, you get, 500 words, 600 words, 800 words. In a sense, you're getting a hint of a story. And just from all of those stories, I knew that there was so much out there when it comes to African women's experiences of sex and sexualities. And I knew those stories were not in the mainstream. They were on our blog, on other, feminist sites, African feminist sites, but it wasn't part of the dominant narrative around African women's experiences of sex and sexuality. And I felt that what I would see as a dominant narrative was very negative. It was very limiting, especially in Western media. African women would usually be portrayed as quite passive, as victims of, domestic violence, women who had experienced FGM, who had been, who were suffering from HIV and AIDS. And that may be part of the story, but I knew for sure it wasn't the full story. I knew we also had agency, we also experienced pleasure in our lives. And I wanted to basically interview African women from across the continent and the diaspora about the experiences of sex, sexuality, and pleasure, and put that in a book, because I think, well, I thought, and I think I've been proven right, that it would show just how wide-ranging and how complicated and how complex and how interesting and how dynamic our stories are.
Yeah. When I emailed you, I told you like I couldn't read this book during the day because I'm doing it at night, because usually I have my little nighttime reading, and I would read it at night and I would just get so like engrossed in the stories, but also so worked up, like, because each of the stories are able to capture both, like, first of all, it is incredibly, even for me, like, this is what I study, and I'm like, it's incredibly rare to get this collection of African women talking so frankly about sex. And I felt like, so like, I just, reading it, is just something really startling about that. And I felt like, when you're growing up in an African household, and your mother and her friends are talking, or, and then they see you listening, they say, get out, adults talk. Yeah. Adults are talking, and then you get sent to your room, and then that's when they're talking about something good. I felt like this is what that book feels like, like it's good adult talk, and they're talking about something good. And so I felt this real pleasure in being able to listen to these stories, or read these stories. But one thing that I thought your book did so well was that it captured, like, there's so much pleasure, but I was actually more taken by the fact that there's so much pain, right? And there's so much, like, you're able to do both really well. Like, there's so much vulnerability that all these people are able to give you. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, like, women are, African women are seeking pleasure, but they're also making themselves so vulnerable. And I thought that was so beautiful how you captured that in this book.
No, thanks so much. I mean, I think if I had my own way, this book would have just been about pleasure. But, like, pain is also part of our experiences, right? And so for me, it was really important to show really the breadth of our experiences. I think for me, what was helpful, because some of the painful stories are really difficult, the experiences of child sexual abuse, for example, I was rather shocked by how, certain things intellectually, but then when you're confronted with it in a very visceral way, it's like, wow, right? And so asking women to tell me about their first sexual experience, or their first memories of sex, and for a lot of people that came from a place of child sexual abuse, that for me was like really, really shocking. I also realized during my interview process that there was a particular question that I was asking that was in a sense inspiring people to tell me that story. And it was really that question: what was your first experience of child sexual abuse? At some point in time, I have to say I stopped asking that question because it got a bit much, but for me, it was important to be able to show both, right? And what for me was encouraging is a lot of people had found ways to heal, even from the very difficult traumatic experiences that they may have had as children. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just maybe talk a little bit more about the process, right? Because when you read this book, it feels extremely intimate. So, and you know, at the end of the book, you sort of talk about wanting to do this project and being invited into these women's homes. And I want to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about that. Like, how did you, you know, enter this space with them, hold this space with them, while they shared these stories that some of them, you know, as they tell them, say like, I've never told anybody this, you know, before.
Absolutely. Well, I think part of what really helps is the fact that, in a sense, I've been doing this work for a really long time. And so people have been sharing with me for well over a decade, their own experiences around sex. And so the very first person I interviewed for this book was a woman called Barbara. And she basically slid into my DMs because she was confused about her sexuality. And so she just wanted to have a conversation with someone that she felt would be open and non-judgmental. And so we had a bit of an exchange. And that was the time I had also made up my mind I was going to write this book. And so I said to her, you know, I'm working on this book about the sex lives of African women. Can I interview you? She came to my house. The first time all we did was drink wine and just chat, right? And the second time she came around, we had a bit of a conversation. And the third time she came around, we finished the interview process. So for me, it was really important to make people feel comfortable, to make people feel safe, to meet them wherever they wanted to meet. There were some people I interviewed in their homes. At the beginning, it was really important to me to just do a lot of face-to-face interview. And in those times, clearly it was also pre-pandemic. I used to travel a lot for my job. So every time I went somewhere, I would just find someone to interview. People introduced me to neighbors who they thought had interest in life. So for example, I interviewed a dominatrix from the UK, and she was a neighbor of a friend. Right? There were some people whose friends told them about this project and they reached out to me. Helen Banda from Malawi, who lives in the States, she sent me a message on Facebook. And I saw that months later because I'm not very active on Facebook. So that was like part of the process. And I think it was really important to me to do the face-to-face interviews, to gain rapport with people. And I think maybe more importantly, for me to also get comfortable with the level of questioning I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to write this in first person, which meant I almost needed to put myself in the shoes of people. It meant I needed a lot of detail. I needed to, you know, in a sense, be able to get a sense of what were they feeling, what were they seeing, what else was going on. So lots and lots of questions. Also, people had the choice of whether they could be anonymous or whether they could use their own names. They didn't have to make that decision straight away. They could make that decision, you know, weeks or months indeed, after we're done the interview. And I think that really all helped give people a sense of trust and confidence and enable people to open up. And a lot of people don't really get the chance to talk about sex, right? And so for a lot of people, yes, I was the first person that were telling some of the really difficult traumatic experiences they've had. And I think for me, what was also really helpful is it felt to me like for people that was also healing to be able to talk about subjects that they had never really been able to talk about before.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing like that this book, it's almost like, it's hard for me to sort of to express the many things that this book does. And I'm so excited that it's in the world, because one thing that it accomplishes is that it really shows queerness in what I think is like a compelling and challenging African feminist way, where queerness is not like this identity that can be claimed or stable. And I love the stories where people would be like, yeah, so, you know, I was having this experience and there's a woman I was attracted to. And so I just decided that one day I was gonna like try and see and sleep with her, right? And I really feel like there's this book by Gloria Becker, which actually is on my desk right now, The Politics of Passion, which she, you know, has a sort of similar narrative where it's, you know, in Afro-diasporic cultures, right? Queerness is not like the stable fixed thing that, you know, in Western culture, you have to like claim and you come out and it's this event and then you are fixed as a sort of like queer subjects, right? And in this story, in this book, you see all this like just the flow of sexuality in really interesting ways. And I was like so excited about that we have like this book to be able to tell that story of a really situated Afro-diasporic queerness. So I don't know if, yeah, like that theme is really present in this collection.
Yes, no, and I love that, right? Because I personally think of sexuality as a spectrum. You know, I don't think sexuality needs to be fixed. I think it could be changing. I think people may choose how they want to identify, and they would have their reasons for, you know, identifying in a particular way. So what comes to mind, for example, is the story of Amena from Egypt, you know, who identifies as a lesbian. And, you know, with her story, she really sort of tells us about her relationship with this one woman, how she came into her queerness also at the same time when they were out in the streets fighting for the revolution, and how, you know, at the time that I was interviewing her, she had started to have sex with men, and some people were trying to say, oh, that means you're bisexual. And she's like, no, I'm not bisexual, I'm a lesbian. You can't tell me the fact that I've loved women my whole life and I've been in struggle with women my whole life, and now because I've slept with a man, you're trying to claim I'm bisexual. No, I'm not, you know? So I also love that. I love the fluidity of sexuality as well as people's insistence on what they were. And that was one of the questions I'd always ask people: how do you identify in terms of your sexuality, right? And how people identified did not necessarily match what I think a neat dictionary definition would say. And for me, that was super, super interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because I read that a couple of days ago, the story, and I remember thinking, wow, yeah, you know, if that were my friend, and she's, you know, she's a lesbian, and she's telling me she slept with a man, I think, you know, and she's, you know, talking about being judged in these queer spaces and people feeling like they can now speak on what she is. And I loved the ambivalence of, you know, at the end of it, she's sort of like, this has just happened and I'm just processing it, you know, and I'm sort of frustrated because I don't know what to make of it, right? I had this desire, I acted on it. And I love the openness of that story because even she's like, I don't know, I slept with a man, you know? I thought that was really wonderful. Like sexuality should be filled with like more ambivalence and openness and discomfort, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like we should also learn to be comfortable in the, you know, ambivalence and not always feel like we need this really tightly defined label that we cannot, like, you know, move freely within.
Yeah. So we've got ambivalence, we've got discomfort. And another theme that I wanted to think about is selfishness. Because, you know, when I was reading this and I was thinking about, you know, like when I think about what are some like core Black feminist texts, I think Sula, right, is like, and in Sula, you have that line where she says, I don't want to make somebody else, I want to make myself, right? And that is like her comment on her, right, rejecting heteronormativity, rejecting marriage, rejecting, you know, motherhood. I don't want to make somebody else, I want to make myself. And as I was reading this book, I thought, there's so many moments where women say, I love this person, but I'm not interested in this. And I thought, that's so brazen, right? Like it is, and you know, there's nothing wrong with saying it's a selfishness, right? And so I wanted to hear you think about like African women and selfishness, and having this book be a space where women are able to say like, I want this thing, and you know, this person that I'm with doesn't want it. And I think it's okay that they don't want it. And I'm okay maybe hurting someone's feelings. I'm okay letting this person go because of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you also reminded me of Estelle's story. You know, Estelle she's of mixed heritage. So Ghanaian, British, Syrian, Lebanese. And, you know, that was really her experience, where she was, for all intents and purposes, in a happy marriage, but knew she wanted to explore her sexuality, knew she wasn't monogamous, and that's not who her husband was, right? And so she was like, yes, this marriage on the surface is good. My husband loves me. I love him. but I need to find myself. And I think it's actually a really brave thing to do, right? Because as women, we're socialized to want exactly that, right? A good husband, whatever that means, a happy marriage, whatever that means. And once you find that you're meant to be content, so what happens when you're not content? What happens when there's something within you that says there's more that you want to experience? And what happens when, you want to create space to experiment? Because we're never encouraged to experiment as girls. We're never encouraged to sow our wild oats. And so me, I actually found it really inspiring when women would be like, you know what? I want to try something different. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'm going to have any regrets, but I am going to, step outside of the box and see what else is out there.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it, thinking about like the whole question about that, or animates this series, like what makes a radical book. And I think that's where, part of the radical potential lies is in like, I think a reader who picks this up, that should push them a little bit, right? To read these stories of women who are behaving in ways that we would say like, this is a selfish choice, right? Even that, the first narrative that hits you, which is the BDSM one, right? And you're like, where she's, sort of pushing her husband to, I forget the name now, right? Pushing her husband to like, try BDSM. And she's like, I started just going by myself. Right. And I think that there is something really compelling about being able to read Black women like foreground their desires so unapologetically, so right, without making any sort of excuses. Like, my husband was a little squeamish about BDSM, so we decided that I was going to do it, and I'm the one who really takes pleasure in it, and that's okay. Like, because they're part of the labor of being, right, gendered as a woman, is making things okay for other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I'm just reading these stories and it's like, no, he doesn't enjoy it. That's fine. I'm the one who's going to go to the dungeons. Right. That was really exciting to me.
Yeah, no, that was really exciting for me as well, and one of the things, one of the women I interviewed, Alexis, she's a queer 70-year-old African-American woman, fell in love with her partner. They both fell in love with each other in their 60s, which for me was really, really inspirational. And one of the things she said that really stayed with me is that she and her partner had decided that, Black people were never really encouraged to be in our bodies. We're never really encouraged to be decadent or hedonistic. And for them, nothing they agreed to do, they were not going to see anything they'd agreed to do as perverse. In fact, they were deliberately going to practice and cultivate decadence in their lives and in their sexual experiences with each other. And I thought that was beautiful. Yeah, I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, I loved that story. And I love, how she talks about food as a real site of pleasure and the erotic. Yes. And the way that they cook for each other, right?
Absolutely.
And, expanding our view of the erotic.
Absolutely. Yes, totally.
Yeah. To jump off from Alexa's story, one of the accomplishments of this book is that, I think that, even for my own work, it's always like you do want to tell a really complete story of Blackness, of Africanness, but that you can't capture, right, everyone. But this book really does like have such a breadth of experience. Alexis is a 70-year-old woman, right? You have trans women in this book. So there's a way in which, much like the way that the story of queerness is woven throughout this book, what it means to be Black, what it means to be woman is really expanded throughout this book. So why was that important for you to be able to sort of have as broad, to be able to talk about Blackness and queerness and womanhood in this really broad way that encompasses generations and like, even location, like what is Africa, right, as a geographic space, I think is really challenged by this book.
Yes, and for me that was really deliberate, and it was also important. I identify as a Pan-Africanist. Also, I'm a feminist, and part of what I've also been doing over the years is just connecting with Black feminists from across the globe. And until a few years ago, I had no idea of how truly vast the African diaspora is, right? I had no idea that there were really strong communities of African descendants in places like Honduras and Costa Rica. And when I realized that, my mind was really blown. And for me, it was important to, in a sense, show that breadth of African heritage in my book, right? And the same way, it was important for me to show the breadth of womanhood, you know, show women as they are, whether they're cis, whether they're trans, whether they're sex workers, whether they're women with disabilities. It was just really important for me to show that breadth and that diversity, because I think that's valuable, and I think that makes our experiences all the richer. And one of the things that I've really loved hearing from people is how much they've just learned about other people and understood other people just by reading the book. You know, it's been really good to hear that kind of feedback.
Yeah. And I mean, it's such, because of course we know that your hand is through this book, right? Because you do interviews and they don't, you know, you didn't just like reproduce them without sort of crafting something out of them. But I think a real achievement is that your hand is in there, but then it doesn't sort of, right? There's some books that you read where the editor's hand then like takes over the narrative. So at the end, I noticed that you wrote part of it during a fellowship. So I was wondering, like, thinking about the craft of this, how did you write in such a way where your voice, your vision doesn't take over the voices of the subjects that you interviewed?
That's a great question. I think for me, the important thing was to try and really understand as much from the person's point of view as possible, you know, to, in a sense, put myself in their shoes, because I was going to be writing in the first person, to get a lot of detail from the people I was interviewing, to, you know how they felt, what their partner looked like, what else was going on in their lives, what was happening in the environment around them. Yeah, that was like really, really important to me. And that was just what I tried to do. I wasn't trying to like impose my own views. You know, it was almost to just allow the person to channel the story through me. And yes, of course, you know, I had like an interview with someone and then wrote a story. So I did have to craft the story. But what I tried to do was just to present, and I guess the most compelling way, what I'd heard from my conversations with the women I interviewed.
Yeah. It's a very generous book. And so I'm glad that you were the person who brought these stories to light. I think that there's something unique that you are able to elicit from the people that you're talking to, and then the way that you put the narrative together. So just a compelling feminist text in that regard. So this book has been out for like a year now. And so I was wondering what the reception has been like for you, not only in Ghana, but just as the book has moved throughout the world. What have you gotten from people, women, patriarchs? Yeah, how has this book moved through the world since it's been out?
Yeah, so the first edition came out in the UK in July 2021, and then the US edition came out. Yeah, this is the US edition.
I discovered.
Yes. Yeah. The US edition came out in March this year, 2022. The feedback has been extremely positive. I just got back from a trip to Kenya, where I was just like amazed at how people have taken the book to heart. Bookshops there say it's been one of their best sellers. A sign of that is the fact that the book has been pirated as well, which I'm told is what happens to really popular books.
Is it a WhatsApp soft copy? Everyone's always buy the book. You don't need a soft copy. Support the writer.
I know. I was doing book signings, and some people will come up with books for me to sign, and I'll say, "I'm sorry, this is really not a legitimate copy of the book." But yeah. For me, part of what has been really heartwarming is for people to say to me, like, I identified with so many stories. I've never felt so seen before. The feedback has been incredible, really, just affirming.
Yeah. One of my thoughts is I have so many people that I'm definitely going to buy this book for, because I want them to read it, and then I want to like watch them while they read it, and then I off the book, because there's so many, I mean, you know, my friends and I are pretty frank about sex, but there's so many things where I'm like, wow, you know, even we haven't talked about thing, right? In terms of our own vulnerabilities, and the way that, you know, we can get hurt, and the way that we make ourselves open to people as Black women, right? That's a really hard place to go, I think, in terms of really expressing that, because I think even me as like a feminist, I think part of how I've embodied it is a certain kind of invulnerability. Like, you know, I'm a Black woman, I'm an African woman, and I can handle my shit. And like, part of what this book does is like, you can handle your shit, but it gets a little hard out here.
True.
And you know, and I think that's really important. And so I wanted you to talk maybe about, you know, the choice to then include your narrative at the end, and which is beautiful, which is hard, which is so many things, vulnerable, right? It really takes us there. So I wanted to hear you sort of the process of putting that at the end of the book, and writing that story.
Yeah, no, when I started this book project, to be honest, I hadn't thought of including my own story. You know, I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to interview as many women as possible. And then once I'd done about 20 interviews, it became really clear to me that I needed to put myself on the line, really. I couldn't ask people to be vulnerable, to share their deepest secrets with me, and then share that with the world and not really put myself on the line. I felt like it was an important part of feminist practice to do that, right? I definitely didn't want to come across as like the anthropologist, you know, looking at people and then just writing about them. And yeah, I think that was important. I think it's also really just true of how we are as feminists in terms of sharing stories with one another, learning from one another. And it was just something I had to do, really. It was just something I had to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really compelling choice. And, you know, when I finished that book, I felt such a sense of like completeness, because I thought, yeah, it really kind of, I mean, this is taking us to places, but I've just been thinking a lot about this problem of, you know, being a desiring subject, and like what it means to be a desiring subject, and for Black people to express desire, right? In a world that is structured against us. And like this book helps us to think about that question in a really compelling way. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, you know, in thinking about this book as a document, right? A book has a certain kind of materiality, and you know, part of the promise, the potential of a book as an object is that it will outlive its author. It will immortalize the author in some sort of way. And in Amina's story, right, one of the anchor points of that story is that she finds Women and Sex by Nawal El-Saadawi, and this book kind of activates, right, her feminist consciousness. So this book is going to have an afterlife, right? It's a material thing. If we still have libraries, it will be in a library. It will certainly be in the collections of African women that their children sneak, right? They'll see this title. I'm even like, right? Imagine me as a 10-year-old seeing this title on my mom's bookshelf. I would have been like, yeah, I want to read that and get in trouble. So who is the subject, the young person that you imagine stumbling upon this in their mother's collection, naughtily sneaking this book off?
I mean, I think one of the favorite things that people have said to me is that they're going to gift this to their daughters, right? People who even don't have daughters yet have said they're going to gift this to their daughters. I dedicated the book to my daughter, Asantua, right? Because I think from this book, you get the knowledge that a lot of us didn't get growing up for a whole host of reasons. And there's no better way to learn than from, like people who could be your sisters, your mothers, your aunties, your friends. And yeah, I just imagine this book as for women and girls, wherever they are in their lives. One of the things I've also enjoyed people saying to me is this book has made me question my sexuality. It's made me want to start my own journey of self-discovery. And I feel like you can do that no matter what age you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I know it's not the point of the book, but then when I was reading this, I was like, I need to be having better sex. Like,
yes, we all do.
I was like, yeah, there's really no excuse. It's like, one really gets a sense from this, like, no, you can take charge and you can really articulate what you want. There's no reason not to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And if that's what the book does in the world, my mission here has been accomplished.
Yeah, I think it will, right? I think it will. And I mean, when we think about, the radical potential of African feminism, right? A lot of us are working and living in contexts where, governed by what Grace Musila has called phallocracies, right? These nation states that are just, so structured by this patriarchal nationalism. So like, this book can make a space out of and through that. And I wonder, like, in Africa, in which this book would be on an A-level syllabus, like, truly, I mean, that is something like, that is a future Africa that we can imagine. Like this book, there's some sort of curriculum, gender studies curriculum that is part of the high school education, part of, and this book would be on some sort of A-level list.
That will be amazing. That will truly be amazing. That's definitely a future that I want to be a part of.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what is so exciting about this book and what it opens up and what it makes, what it makes possible. So I don't know if you had any last words or anything that you wanted us to think about in terms of this book and
Well, just in terms of last words, I mean, I feel like one of the things I personally took away from the book, from the women I interviewed, was that, there's no one way of healing. There are different ways in which to find healing. A lot of us have experienced truly traumatic, things. And I think it's important to take the space and time to heal, but it's also important to recognize that healing is not one-dimensional. For some people, sex was healing. For some people, practicing celibacy was healing. For some people, healing was going on a spiritual retreat. And I guess my encouragement would be to people to figure out and make space to find out what healing for them looks like.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for making that space for African women to heal through the labor of love that produced this book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for making the time.
Bhakti, I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm muted. That was amazing.
That's a lovely end to that.
Yeah, beautiful. Do you want to say a little about what's coming?
Yes, so we're headed for our final stop on our Radical Desire itinerary. I think we're going to shift now in a few different ways. Shift geographies, shift languages, shift genre again. And we're also going to kind of do some gender shifting away from the explicit focus we've had on women's narratives into a kind of more gender fluid space of of queer boyhood, really, with this volume, which has been coined the first published collection of queer Korean poetry, Kim Hyun's Glory Hole. So yeah, we'll pull up another pre-recorded conversation between myself,
everyone, I'm back and here.
Go ahead.
I'll introduce them. Go ahead, start it.
All right.
Now with Suhyun and Archana Madhavan, who are co-translators of a wild new poetry collection by Korean poet Kim Hyun titled Glory Hole, which is set to be released from Seagull Books next month. Welcome, Suhyun and Archana. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
We're spanning 3 time zones here for this conversation, so this is a pre-recording, but we're really delighted to have you both as guests for our Radical Books Collective event, Beware My Smile on Radical Desire. Suhyun An has been translating Korean poetry into English since 2014 and is founder and chief of the literary journal Nabilera, Contemporary Korean Literature. You're joining us now from South Korea, but I understand you're also a PhD student just up the road from here at Princeton University in the Department of East Asian Studies. And your research, if I'm not wrong, is focused on Confucian philosophy.
Yeah, it is. A little bit different.
Well, I'll let you speak for yourself. Archana Madhavan, who joins us now from San Jose, California, so we're really spanning the globe here, has been translating from Korean since 2019. And in her day job, Archana works as a learning experience designer at a tech company. So a really warm welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I definitely want to talk to both of you about your own relationship to this book, and how you were first introduced to Kim Hyun's poetry, what drew you to translating it. But I thought, since folks who are listening won't have been able to get their hands on the book yet, we could maybe start by giving a bit of a sneak peek, maybe pun intended, into Glory Hole. I know for me, this is a book of poetry really unlike anything I've read before. And I found reading it to be an exhilarating and truly disorienting experience. So I'm particularly curious to hear how each of you would describe the collection in your own terms.
Well, you're exactly right. It's very disorienting. So, and it has a lot of identities that are clashing together. At first, it's queer, obviously, but it also has sci-fi, pornography, and it's coming of age, which sounds a little. Traditionally, it would be inappropriate to put coming of age and pornography, but it's there. And it is constantly crossing the line between what's real and what's not real. So yeah, I just gotta use a lot of adjectives to describe it, and I don't know how to describe it otherwise.
Yeah, Archana, I don't know what you would say as a kind of overarching description of the book.
Yeah, disorienting definitely is an apt word. Weird. Mind bending. It's kind of like, not that I have any experience being in zero gravity, but I feel like it's kind of like how astronauts might feel in zero gravity, where they're trying to figure out what's up and down and right and left, but there's no orientation really that you can grab onto, and so you're just kind of flailing. So that's a little bit how the experience of translating was like for me. But there is a rhyme and reason and a structure to some extent in a lot of his work, and it's kind of, you have to sort of be the archaeologist sometimes to excavate and find that meaning, and that's what made the collection super exciting and interesting to me.
Yeah, I love what you said about sort of, no gravity or the astronaut experience.
Yeah.
I think we talk a lot at the Radical Books Collective about what makes the book radical, and it seems to me that part of what makes this collection radical is that kind of refusal to let us get comfortable, where is the ground? And anytime it sort of starts to become clear, it sort of gets pulled out from under us again. I feel like this is a playful book, but it has sharp edges. There's a lot of shocking moments and a lot of painful and sort of sorrowful moments as well. But I was wondering, I would really love to hear you talk about the footnotes also. I mean, I this was a total first for me. This is, I mean, it's mostly prose poetry, and almost every poem in the collection has, 3, 4, sometimes more footnotes, kind of as addenda to the poem themselves. And you might think that these, since this is poetry that's full of well, we can talk about this later further, but like very dense with references to other literature and popular culture and so forth, you'd think these might be kind of explanatory, but they end up kind of plunging you deeper into into confusion. I don't know. I don't know if either of you would say anything about that kind of generic structure of these poems.
Yeah, I think for me, I remember exactly what you said. Like usually footnotes are there to provide clarity and context. And especially in a work that has this many allusions and intertextual like references, you would think that the footnotes would kind of be like, hold your hand a little bit, but no, and instead it is there to make the reading experience almost non-trivial. Like you have to be incredibly engaged, and sometimes it's there deliberately to confuse. And I think, Suhyun, you can say more, but one hilarious part of the footnotes is that some of the footnotes actually being marked translator, which are not by us.
Oh my goodness.
It confused our editor also.
Yeah. He said oh, this is unnecessary.
Yeah, he was like, you don't need this.
It doesn't clarify the context. And we were like, that's not by us. It's actually by the poet.
Wow. I was thinking that you were doing this very clever, slipping in your own notes among these other notes. No, those aren't.
No, those are the poet saying translator.
Right. Yeah, my philosophy is that translators have to be translators. So I wouldn't put anything the poet didn't put there. But yeah, it's footnotes were I think they were the hardest part of translation. And there were very few poems that do not have footnotes. And to be honest, I was excited when I saw, there's no footnote. It's not hard because at some point, if finding out the references and everything embedded in the footnote is so much of work, and it was really challenging. It was fun, but you just have to think where these footnotes are placed, I would say. So it's not the part of poem, but it's still a part of poem. It's kind of pushed aside. And so you have to be conscious of that kind of the being othered from the poem, but still an active part of it. So yeah, it was an interesting experience, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, well, maybe we should back up now, and I'm curious how you ended up co-translating this work together. I mean, what brought you to it, to Kim Hyun's poetry in the first place?
So I featured 5 of the Kim Hyun's poems in Nabulera. And when I was organizing that issue, I wanted to cover queer literature because it's underrepresented. Although the writers and the poets are like rising stars in Korea. So anyway, I just wanted to have that out. And when Kim Hyun was obviously one of the candidates for me because there are very, very few queer poets. There are many more queer novelists or queer short stories, but it is very rare to see thematic poem that is written about gays. So he was definitely one of the candidates. And when I read the poem, it was such a strong experience. It just blew my mind away. And as Archana and you said, it is disorienting, but it also has something concrete. There's something concrete about it. And what I felt was that his experience as a gay person, he was born in 1980s, so he was growing up in 80s and 90s. And there weren't that many queer representation back then in Korea. So I'm imagining that his experience as a gay teenager was totally disorienting. There is no word to describe it. The experience is scattered all over the places. And I felt like this really captures it well. And it's the experience of queer person growing up in the 90s. So yeah, that's why I went for it. And while I was translating, and then I got a call. I got an email from Sigil Books, so I started to translate it. But it was so hard, so I reached out to Archana, who was a translator for Nabulera, and we got to the task.
Yeah, Suhyun brought me into the project, and actually my first experience working with the Suhyun, as he mentioned, is actually for a novella that I co-translated for Nabulera. And interestingly, that issue the theme was anal realism, which I was like, oh, that ties in. Like I didn't even like make the connection until I was just kind of reflecting on that. I was like, that ties in nicely with how I ended into Glory Hole. But the novella that I translated had shared a lot of kind of characteristics of Kim Hyun's work. It was very visceral. There was sexual language. There was sort of a surrealist nature to the story, and that, in a lot of ways, I think, kind of primed me for the experience of translating Kim Hyun. And a few of the kind of exchanges Suhyun and I had over that particular novella, I think, kind of kickstarted the relationship and working relationship in this particular collection. So that's how I got involved.
I wonder if you could read to us a little bit. I mean, knowing that our audience won't have a chance to get their hands on the book until next month. If, at least one poem, if you could read it for us in both the original and your translation.
Sure. Should we start with Korean or English?
Start with the original. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Do Korean first.
Cool. So it's titled 늙은 베이비 호모. 자줏빛 비가 내리는 여름의 텅 빈 교실에서 처음으로 감정을 빨았네. 어금니를 깨물고 축구화를 구겨시는 거무튀튀한 감정이었지. 무릎을 꿇은 창밖으로 시간의 좀들은 하얗게 피어오르고 일렬 횡대로 젖은 운동장을 행군해오는 두꺼비 떼의 구령에 맞춰 녀석은 힘껏 달렸네. 나는 녀석의 반짝이는 드리블을 떠올렸지. 골을 넣을 때마다 퍽을 내뱉던 녀석의 입술은 퍽 신비로웠어. 침으로 범벅이 든 감정은 부드럽고 미끄덩하고 곧 줄줄 흘러내렸네. 감정의 불화를 감추고 녀석은 황량하고 사랑스러운 발길질로 나를 걷어찼지. 유리창 안에서 시간에 좀먹은 내가 늙은 신부처럼 나를 나처럼 바라볼 때 녀석은 똥 묻은 팬티를 끌어올리고 사라지고 아름답고 나는 면사포처럼 속삭였어. 안녕. 그리고 녀석들을 본 사람은 없네. 아무도. 그래, 아무도. 엉클스 버거 냅킨으로 홈타운의 케첩을 닦아내던 우리는 왜 서둘러 늙었을까? 소시지 컬 가발을 쓰고 썩은 맥주를 마시는 오래된 밤. 나는 알 수 없이 노래하네. 카운트다운이 끝나기도 전에 소년의 궤도 밖으로 로켓을 쏘아 올린 녀석들을 위하여. 안녕. 지금 또 축구화를 구겨 신고 자줏빛 여름에게서 도망치고 있을 글로리 홀의 누런 뻐드렁니 호모들의 감정을 위하여. 그리고 건배. There are 4 footnotes. I'm going to read them one by one. The first footnote. 이 노래에 도움을 준 계절들을 밝히 적는다. 봄의 각성, 자줏빛 여름의 노래, H와의 가을과 가을의 H, 그리고 이 세상에 없는 계절이었던 민. 1-1. 이 주석에 도움을 준 노래들을 밝히 저극화하다. 어둠 속에 두기로 한다. 다만 사랑의 기원, 거지 같은 흰둥이, 코치는 나를 범하고 내가 소년이었을 때라는 존과 찰스와 그렉과 민의 노래를 언젠가 들은 적이 있다고만. Second footnote. 이 구멍에 도움을 준 공중 화장실을 대신하여 팝 아티스트 키스 헤링의 1980년작 Glory Hole을 어두침침하게 그려넣는다. Third footnote. 그리스어에서 사용되던 접두어로서 닮았다는 뜻이 있다. 그 때문에 현재까지도 유럽 계열의 언어군에서 호모로 시작되는 단어는 같은이라는 뜻을 포함하는 경우가 많다. 동성애를 뜻하는 homosexuality의 줄임말로 사용되기도 하지만 동성애자인 꾼인 운동 이후 남성 동성애자는 게이, 여성 동성애자는 레즈비언이라는 단어로 대체되었다. 옮기니 주. This is the end of it.
Okay, I will read the English translation. The title is Old Baby Homo. In an empty summer classroom where purple rain comes, I sucked emotion for the first time. The emotion was murky, like when I jammed my soccer cleats while clenching my teeth. Moths of time burgeoned in a white cloud outside the window where I was kneeling. To the command of a herd of toads that were marching down the wet schoolyard in a single file, my buddy dashed with all his might. I remembered his sparkling dribble. His lips blurted fuck every time he scored, and quite magically so. The emotion muddled up with drools was soft and slippery. Soon it streamed down, hiding the testicles of emotion. My buddy gave me a dry and lovely kick. It was when I, inside the window, looked at myself like an old bride, having been eaten up by time. He pulled up his pants, stained with poop, and disappeared, and was beautiful, and I whispered like a wedding veil, goodbye. And nobody had seen them. Nobody. Yes, nobody. Why have we, who were wiping hometown ketchup with a napkin from Uncle's Burger, aged so hastily? The tattered night when we wear a wig with sausage curls and drink fetid beer, I sing unintelligibly. For the sake of the buddies who shot a rocket beyond the boy's orbit before the countdown was over. Goodbye, for the sake of the homos' emotions who are at a glory hole with yellow buck teeth, who must be fleeing from purple summer in their crumpled soccer cleats, and cheers. And now the footnotes. 1. Here are the seasons that lent a hand to the song, the disenchantment of spring, the song of purple summer, H and autumn and H of autumn and Min, the season that does not exist in this world. 1-1. I thought of introducing songs that lent a hand to this note, but I decided to leave them in the dark, except I've listened to John and Charles and Greg and Min's The Origin of Love, White Puppy Like a Beggar, The Coach Violates Me, and When You Were a Boy. 2. This word comes from a Greek prefix meaning to be alike. In consequence, in many European languages, homo still means to be the same. It is sometimes used as a shortened version of homosexuality. But since the start of the LGBT rights movement, male homosexuals have been called gays and female homosexuals lesbians. Translator. 3. In place of the public restroom that provided a space for the hole, I bleakly draw in pop artist Keith Haring's work, Glory Hole, 1980.
Thank you so much.
This was actually one of the original 4 poems that was in Nebulera, I believe, that you published.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Right.
But this was also a co-translation.
Not this particular
this
one.
was my translation.
This was Suhyun's translation, which I read. When I was actually, right before, like about 30 minutes before this call, we were planning on wanted to kind of read a different poem. But then I was like, I think this poem is really representative of the rest of the collection. I was actually kind of, and we were talking about this a little bit, how Kim balances the very visceral and uncomfortable language with sometimes strikingly beautiful language, and I was kind of naturally drawn to something that was like more beautiful or more elegant in my mind. But then I was like, I wanted to kind of read something that was more disorienting, more sort of representative of the kind of specific things that are interesting about this collection. So
I gotta say, the reason why I covered this poem for the Nebulera was Kim Hyun wanted it. I asked Kim Hyun, choose like 4 poems from your poetry collection, and he chose this. So I think Kim Hyun also thinks that this is representative of his work.
Could you say a little more about the translation process itself? I mean, either your collaboration with one another, but also I'm particularly interested to hear about I mean, and there are some examples in that poem that you just read of the as you've said, the kind of the sensual and the strange and the grotesque kind of all rubbing up against one another, and sometimes really moving from the playful to the monstrous kind of and it seems to me that language register must be difficult when you're dealing with those kinds of transitions. I mean, can you think of examples that were particularly hard to translate from the collection?
So to answer the first one, how we work together, I think that part we can just cover it really quickly. So basically, I translated a portion of the poetry collection, and Archana translated the other, and then we would comment on each other's work and critique it, and then come up with a better translation together. So that was the process. And the rest of the question you asked, I forgot. So what was the question exactly? What was our translation experience?
I'm wondering if there are any examples of particularly difficult lines or phrases, among those sort of sexually explicit or corporeal language. And I was talking particularly about, shifts and register, but really anything that posed a translation challenge, I'd be interested to hear about.
So I actually have an example from another poem, not this one. So it's a poem called 산파들의 세계사, A World History of Midwives. And the style of the poem is East Asian, martial arts literature, which is traditional East Asia. But obviously there's a lot of sexual references here. And so I had to find the balance. So one line I was thinking of was, in the middle of the night, as the moon throbs to the occasional sound of the skins hitting, the village widows retch unwarranted, and some give birth effortlessly. Yeah. So in this one, so the part I was not necessarily having a trouble, but I was thinking a lot was 벌떡벌떡 달뜬 한밤. So it's the in the middle of night as the moon throbs. So here the subject is moon, and verb is 뜨다, get up, and adverb is 벌떡벌떡. It's a mimetic word for getting up, but you wouldn't use it for the sun rises or the moon rises. It's either you are forcefully getting up, and so it is also used for when you are having a boner. So it was obvious that there is that sexual thing going on. So the first one I was thinking was pretty literal. The moon is erected, but that wouldn't be strong enough. But the moon gets a boner. That's too direct. It's too strong. So I had to I was thinking about other expressions that's not necessarily to get up, but still gives a similar experience when you read. So I ended up with throbbing. And the later in the line, there's 배 맞추는 소리. It literally means the sound of your tummy being aligned with someone else's. But so it is the euphemism of having sex, but actually the original euphemism is 배꼽, not 배, which is belly button, not a belly. So the poet is making euphemism, but he's making a euphemism for a euphemism, and it's not an actual Korean word or expression we use. He just changed it a little bit. Yeah, he played with it a little bit. So yeah, I was thinking about how to keep the same imagery, and I ended up doing sounds of the skins hitting, the skins of two people coming together, and I was hung up about getting the exact meaning of it, but yeah, it still works. So yeah, those are the processes I went through.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think is also really valuable of like having a co-translator, especially like, you know, commenting on saying like, this needs to convey more this, like it needs to be stronger in this way, or I want to get the rhyme here, I want to like echo this yeah, some other poetic kind of form, or yeah, it's really valuable to kind of just have that dialogue back and forth. And I think that was one of the nice things about having a co-translator for work that's as complex as this one.
Yeah, so like, you know, when you translate a poetry, I think it's also about what you give up, you know, what you not translate, what you can't translate. You know, you have to weigh in sometimes, you know, you can't get all the rhymes, but you know, so there are many options you have to choose from. And so, yeah, co-translation, especially for this work where you have to lose a lot of things, as a translator, you get a little bit hesitant, right? Like if you're too used to translating things perfectly, beautifully, and it should make sense and it should flow. So I had to resist this instinct, you know, as a translator. I want this to sound beautiful. I want this to sound perfect. And then, you know, when you have a co-translator, they're gonna be like, no, this has to be more violent. This has to be more disturbing. And so I think, you know, it was really good to work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think Suhyun, you described me in that situation, like my tendency to want to like make things, to kind of force meaning where sometimes there wasn't any meaning. The whole like the individual sentence or whatever it was, like that wasn't as important as the overall effect of the work. And so I would, you know, he would sort of rein me back from like, yes, this part is confusing, but it's supposed to be confusing. Like this is confusing even in Korean. And definitely as a person who's like fairly new at the time, fairly new to translation, as well as not a heritage speaker, there were many times where I would question, like, am I not understanding this because I'm not good at Korean? Or am I not understanding this because I'm really not supposed to understand this? So,
at some point, Archana, you felt like you are not a good enough translator.
Oh yeah,
and that's why you're
like,
not getting this poem. And I was like, no, like I don't get it either, right? And like at one point, I was like searching through the references, and I just didn't get it. Like, what is this word? It doesn't make sense. And I was searching it, couldn't find it, so I emailed the poet. What did you mean here? And he was like, oh, I just made the word up. It doesn't exist. And so, yeah, those kind of things happen. And yeah, for Koreans.
Actually, there's a poem now. I can't remember now the title of the poem, but isn't there a poem in the collection about vanishing words, a bowl of vanishing words? And there's something about, you know, that they have meaning in a dream, and then they lose their meaning when the character wakes up. And I'm just thinking of that even as you're speaking. I mean, it seems like it seems to me also with those, I mean, that beautiful detail that that in the footnotes that are attributed to the translator are not actually clearly a poet who's thinking about translation in some way, who's thinking about that kind of transfer of meaning. And I was actually going to ask you, the collection includes an afterword by the professor and poet Park Sang-soo, which was very helpful to me reading through it and kind of parsing some of the references in the poems. But I was particularly struck by a line that she writes, that the style, I quote here, the style and sensibility of these poems resemble that of translated poetry. So, you know, in her reading, this is in some way already translated. And I was curious to hear from the two of you, in light of these things, you know, how, or if at all, that characterization of the poetry inflected your process, you know, that kind of how the readerly experience of unfamiliarity or disorientation that we've been talking about complicates that task of translation, or intersects with it, or mimics it in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this. And I think, in the process of sort of parsing one language into another, you sometimes end up with this combination of words that's so delightfully startling. And Kim achieves that in his first language without having that process of translation there. And like, that example Suhyun mentioned, he just subverts idioms and metaphors and turns figurative language on their heads and uses this language in such brain-bending ways. And while I was translating, I know in some of my earlier drafts, I would have almost this like preemptive defensive-ness. Like I was almost anticipating a reviewer kind of like looking at this and being like, oh, it's awkward or weird, it like doesn't make any sense. And I would try to like force, like inadvertently, I would find myself trying to force this, what my kind of own interpretation of a good translation would look like onto the work, like force meaning on it, force like kind of an elegance to it. And I think Suhyun really pulled me back from that and kind of definitely said, this part is it is supposed to sound this way. This is him being disorienting, but it did make me, often when you read like a work that's translated and there's something like, we can have a whole talk about, what is awkward or natural for a native English speaker. That blame like always goes to the translator. But then if a translation is great and it's like wonderful and people, there's somehow it passes muster for like what is good literature, then all the praise goes to the writer, right? Like the original writer. So I was like very kind of hyper conscious of that. And maybe that's, I kind of attributed that a little bit to maybe my own kind of immaturity as a translator, like inexperience. I was like kind of really like, how do I make sure that I get across the intent, the feeling that Kim Hyun wants people to have, that people are having in the original Korean, but not be a result of like a translator didn't do the right, the right thing here so I was definitely thinking a lot about that.
Yeah, I agree. I gotta say, I had the exactly same problem. I mean, who doesn't like to hear, "Oh, you did a good job," right? And by nature of this poem, it's seemed like it's really hard to hear that from people, like because it is so subvertive literature. So there was anxiety that's induced from that. But I think because it was such a different type of poems from other poems we've translated, it was definitely fun, and we just had to think a lot. It's like more of revision than like translation. It took a lot of time to revise. And as for the Park Sang-soo's comment about the original poem being sounding like translation, I think, he's right. It sounds like translation, but it also sounds like a bad translation, like the literal translation of like a English text. So there are a lot of transliteration. There are sometimes the poet just uses like an English word, like an alphabet. Don't even like care about transliterating the whole world, the whole word. But so the experience for the Korean readers when you read this is like a very strikingly American Right. You mentioned like in the question, it's strikingly Korean and American, but Koreans, they're used to seeing something Korean, so they would feel like, this is so American. Everything about this is American. So how do you capture this foreignness when you are translating in English, where American readers, they are used to seeing something American? So when they see reference to like Andy Warhol, they're not gonna feel this is really foreign, right? So I think there was that kind of challenge. It's impossible to like make American thing unusual to American readers, but we can still keep the styles, right? The styles that are disorienting. So that's what we focus on.
And it seems like so many of these references, are so decontextualized anyway, that we're they're sort of pulled out and replanted into purely fictional narratives and scenarios.
Yeah, if anything, like I felt more disoriented to see a reference that I understood in a context that was so different. Like I was like, I know who Kate Blanchett is, but then I was reading the poem about Kate Blanchett and I was like, what is happening here?
I'm not Kate Blanchett in Korea, but Kate Blanchett like on another planet.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And he was like, just changed names all the time. Like, there's a band called Skid Row, I think. And then he would be like a Skid Road, Skid something, and it just like changes all the time. And this doesn't happen only in one poem, but you see the same reference like in other poems going back to like one poem, but he's changing the name again and again. And at some point you're like, is he referring to that poem or not? And what is going on? Is there a connection between these poems? And how do we keep the connection while disrupting the connection at the same time? And yeah, it was really fun.
I think you've done an incredible job. I should say that. Everything that you're describing, I feel it in the translation, having no access to the original. So I was wondering, particularly since there's so much kind of transformation that happens to the characters in these poems, we've got characters kind of changing form, metamorphosing between different species, changing gender, aging suddenly. There's so much of this kind of transformation happening. I was wondering, I thought I'd ask if translating this text transformed you at all. If you, either in terms of your translation practice or your reading practice even, or your lens on sexuality around the world. I'm just curious, how you come out of translating something that you've described as mind-bending.
I can start. What a great question. I think in so many ways. I think that, definitely as a translator and reader, I feel transformed. And I think a great translation always starts with at least a very close reading of the text. And I think this work really challenged what that was for me. I always thought that I was a very close, careful reader of the text, particularly because, Korean is not my heritage language. I can't sort of skim and read super fast like I would in English. So I do pay a fair amount of attention when I'm translating. But there would be times where almost like my brain would play tricks on me with I would not pay attention to certain grammar constructions, or I would assume that one adjective was modifying a particular noun, or this verb was applied to this subject in the sentence, and it actually that wasn't the case. And that was again sort of my mind trying to conform to whatever idea of meaning I had in my head in the work that I was reading. And I think that this work sort of told me you can't, at least in poetry, when language can just be bent and broken in all sorts of wonderful ways, to not kind of read so fast that you're kind of obscuring what is actually being said in the text, or you're kind of putting your own what you want the text to read like or sound like onto that. So it's like, yeah, I would say that it's definitely made me a more careful reader and more also just open to kind of the emotion of the entire text and not sort of focusing on a single phrase or a single word, but reading the thing in the whole thing in its entirety, kind of soaking it in and then going for like a line by line or word for word investigation. So I would say that that's how it's changed me.
Cool. I guess the first thing is that I didn't really like prose poems before, right? I didn't like it that much. But I saw how playful a prose poem can be, and it was really delightful to see all of the experiments that was happening here. And also it made me think about how should I say, the disruptive function of the language. It's not that I didn't think about it before, but still, like, it's so condensed, and I've never had this kind of like condensed experience before. In poems, yeah, sure, there are a lot of, not just Kim Hyun's poems, but there are a lot of playfulness, and in short story, there are a lot of playfulness in a different ways, with plots and things like that. But this kind of have a plot, throughout the poems. It's coming of age, but there is no plot at the same time, and there's like this visceral experience of languages. So it just it made me think more about the relationship of having a plot and the language itself, and how it can be tied together, or like how loose it can be, and the middle ground between them.
Suhyun and Archana, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been so delightful to talk to you.
Thank you.
Same here.
I hope the collection will have a really wide readership, and that we'll have another opportunity to talk in the future.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, this is so wonderful.